Good, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A. We're at the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very, very, very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight on a revolving panel of bloggers and Auckland opinion shapers. He is one of the best online sources of news and information in the Southern Hemisphere, working at scoop.co.nz and his new media project, livenews.co.nz. It is the devastatingly brilliant Selwyn Manning. And she is the greatest blogger in New Zealand. From the Auckland University Film, Television and Media Studies Department, the brilliantly devastating Phoebe Fletcher. Welcome to you both tonight. Review the 2011 year in politics and what an apathetic, banal year it has been. Let's kick things off with our first question of both of you. What was the biggest domestic political news story of 2011? Selwyn.
Christchurch earthquake would have to be up there, and some of the work that the mainstream media, particularly the broadcast medium and TV3, for example, did in that arena was very impressive.
It was really one of those moments where the private media stepped up.
It did, and you know, you've got to give credit. We criticise mainstream
all the time.
A lot, particularly in the political coverage that it offers. But when it came to Christchurch, also, you know, you could see that many of its reporters were people from Christchurch themselves who had suffered the earthquake, who had witnessed loss and death. They hadn't just parachuted in, and I think that made all the difference. The newspapers obviously did a fantastic job too, but particularly I thought TV3 and some of TVNZ's on the ground Christchurch Cantabrians were impressive.
You're absolutely right, and I certainly think that the broadcast media deserve accolades there because they were under a lot of pressure when they were broadcasting for no advert breaks at all during that crisis, and they had a lot of pressure from advertisers to start putting advertising back on. They resisted that and they kept the public broadcasting element. They
did, and I think it was an air of respect that they'd picked up. I think politically on that issue it was kind of disappointing that our government of the day did not pick up the mood throughout the country and actually target fund some of the rebuild through levy. And I thought that was a shame because people in Auckland were left, okay, how do we actually help here? Sending goods down and and having sausage sizzles and things like that to express their support was a difficult thing. And I think Auckland has deserved the opportunity to direct assist through a levy, I thought.
Great point. Phoebe, what was the biggest domestic political story?
Well, on that point, I'd have to agree with Selwyn. You can't go past the Christchurch earthquake. It's been a long time since New Zealand has had to deal with a disaster of that size, and also the way that the disaster was highly mediated. I mean, this is really one of the first disasters that New Zealand has faced, where there has been constantly TV cameras there. You know, adding on from the good job that the mainstream media did, I think, was a good job that citizens did in terms of locating people and contacting people through Twitter and so on.
And the students.
Coming in. I mean, it was an issue that brought New Zealand together and had huge political ramifications in terms of the rebuild as well. So there is no going past Christchurch, I think, for the biggest political issue that we had this year.
Question to you, what was the biggest international political news story of the year?
Well, it has to be the Arab uprisings. There's no doubt about it. You've got uprisings basically where you've had protests in 13 nations, you've had 3 dictators toppled. If we look at this, it is still going on. I mean, you've had countries like Bahrain where they've had absolute oppression. You have had laws brought in that make it 5 years imprisonment for spreading false news. They brought the Saudi Arabian army in and Pakistani militia. But also looking at Syria, for example, which is a very key strategic country, you know, you had unofficial reports of death tolls in the last 2 days of more than 260. 97 of those were
that's UN sanction figures.
That's right.
Soldiers that had defected.
Were the Hawks right in holding up Libya as an example of Western aggression that works?
I do think so to some extent, and I know I disagree with a lot of people on this. I have actually talked to a lot of Libyans, and you know, one thing that people do not remember about that country is that it has been execution for having a political opinion since 1973. You had the Abu Salem prison massacre where they slaughtered 1,200 prisoners, and I mean, it's not been verified, but I have seen photographs of a list of 1,000 people that were due to be executed.
So how does the West pick it then? I mean, if we can hold that up as an example of a success, that we got rid of a regime that was quite brutal, where do we I mean, how can we compare that with something like Iraq, for example, which America just pulled out of this
Well,
week?
I don't think that I would agree with someone like Professor Joanne Cole on this, that there is no comparison between Iraq in 2003 and Libya. I wouldn't personally hold it up as a success because, you would have to look at other countries in the region, like Syria has got very good friends with Russia and China on NATO, and there's also a huge amount of political pressure on them because they're very close to Lebanon to not do anything. I mean, what you had in Libya was you had a situation where the interests of a Libyan National Transitional Council coincided with international interests. But I don't think that was as clear cut. I mean, what we are looking at is 0.8% of the world's oil supply.
Yeah.
Okay, it's very highly refined oil, but you have to look
Big
at
European
the fact
market. Big European
that
market.
no, but Europe already had agreements. Okay, you had BP getting through historic agreements. You have to look at the fact that the British SAS were training Gaddafi's troops. You have to look at the fact that MI7 had actually been looking after Saif, his son, while he had been in London. So I think in looking at that, when I see people like the US Secretary of Defence, Robert Gates, saying that he was extremely worried about going into Libya, I think that there was a notion that Gaddafi, was much easier to deal with than the National Transitional Council. And we have seen them, be very worried about, the Islamist government that has come in.
That's right.
That was the risk, was that it was going to be much easier to deal with a dictator than it would the new government.
Egypt was the big success?
I wouldn't call Egypt a success whatsoever at all. What they have got now is a awful military government ruled by a Tantawi that is oppressing its citizens in exactly the same manner. I mean, you only have to look at what has gone on in Egypt over the last few days. I mean, I've seen photographs of women that have had a T carved into their scalp to remind them that the military is their master. You look at, the photographs and video that emerged of soldiers beating up a woman and, basically pulling back her veil to reveal her. I think that Egypt really needs to get rid of its military government, and that SCAF, they have been trying to play it as sectarian violence. There was an incident maybe about a month ago where they had been caught out running over Coptic Christians with tanks, and they tried to say that was Islamists fighting with the Christians, and then the videos came out. So I think that there needs to be more pressure on them for a transition, but that was halted by the US. So I wouldn't say that any of these things are a success, but that sometimes interests co-align, and that these things are always going to be very complicated processes.
The Arab Spring really has been the big international story, hasn't it?
Yeah, there's been many, but certainly, yes, it's most significant. And what also comes to mind on moving on what Phoebe is saying there is really for people who are interested to see the role that the Western nations and corporations in particular have played in providing some of these totalitarian, authoritarian regimes with intelligence gathering technologies.
The British were very embarrassed with how closely they were working with the Egyptians.
People want to know what we're talking about. Just go on to Google or WikiLeaks and put into Google WikiLeaks spy files and have a read. It is creepy. Yeah. The other thing is that obviously there's a great global financial meltdown that is continuing to roll on. People want to really keep up to play with what's going on. I stress go to the Independence and look at interest.co.nz. Bernard Hickey and his team, what they work. He's a panellist on the show. Fantastic work. Back in this region, in the Pacific region, let's remember that there are two superpowers now on the globe, and that's China and the United States, and they are moving on our patch. Not just military hardware starting to show up right across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, but we're looking at polarized kind of control kind of maneuvers going on in the trade pact areas.
Absolutely.
Papua New Guinea, the instability in Papua New Guinea, that all of this registers to everyone living in Auckland. And the destabilisation at governance level in Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, it's starting to look. There are positive trends there. Vanuatu has a few kind of shaky things. Fiji, well, we know a lot about Fiji now. And I suspect, just to tag it back to New Zealand, I think, the placement that the Labour Party did of putting Phil Goff in responsible for picking away at Murray McCully in the foreign affairs areas is a sound move. Phil Goff knows his patch, and Murray McCully has looked poor right from the start.
Question to both of you, biggest political surprise 2011?
Well, I think it has to be New Zealand first and how high it got after the election.
Yep.
I mean, most polls were not predicting 5%, and there you have them at 6.59. You know, that's huge. Yeah, I think that has to be the biggest political surprise. I think that is perhaps coming off the back of the economic recession as well.
Yep.
That what tends to happen under those conditions is you tend to get this kind of nationalist rise. And I think that was not well tagged or predicted by many people.
I think too the absence of a real strong opposition leader helped to assist Winston Peters to actually get a bedrock of support and then move on top of it.
Is that going to make it very bloody difficult for Shearer to get any runs on the board in Parliament next year? Because Winston's going to be all over that, isn't he?
Winston's going to be all over a number of things, but purely and simply all those issues where that is compounding our current account deficit kind of areas. Money, basically, putting it simply, taxpayer money that is going into the private sector under the national government's ideology and then gets siphoned off by overseas companies who are tendering to provide what once was publicly led services.
That's right.
Winston will be all over that. Shearer is a big surprise. I think he is his speech in Parliament this week
was amazing, wasn't it?
It was a very, very impressive speech.
Was.
And it was what we were talking about last week, about when the guy talks from inside about core values, human rights issues, and vision. There's no one better.
No.
You know, and that would be a surprise to many.
Yeah, I was genuinely surprised by how good that speech was.
John Key, in comparison, I think David Slack, panellist on your program, he put it really well, and I think he said something along the lines of that David Shearer gave a speech of hope. John Key did a Bob Hope speech.
Yes.
And I thought that summed up pretty much the whole
he's very good, Slack, isn't he? Question of both of you. The power to take DNA on mere arrest, retrospective spying powers, and the end of jury trials for anything punishable by 3 months or more in prison. How has civil rights fared in this country in 2011?
I don't think that they've fared particularly well at all. I think you would have to say that it's a travesty, the search and surveillance bill that went through, and that there has been not enough time for public debate given over issues of civil rights in New Zealand. And this is something that in the next term I would certainly hope that we have the opportunity to revisit some of the things that have gone through. I mean, to me, it is outrageous, the powers that the police have been given and other organisations.
Yeah, other state organisations.
Just to plant stuff in your house. And,
fishing expeditions, right? They're bloody fishing expeditions. 3 months without a warrant is 3 days without a warrant is just a fishing expedition, isn't it?
It is just a fishing expedition, and the thing is that the cases that we've had in the past don't necessarily prove that the people that they do surveil are the right people.
That's
you only have to look at the Urewera trials or Ahmadzawi, to see that in action.
And what we could see throughout that whole period was a slippery slope being established, and some of these fundamental judicial rights, even, a person's right to recourse to the law under a proper judicial kind of apparatus. I mean, that some of the biggest critics, it might surprise viewers to this program, are not necessarily us. The biggest critics are the judges and the lawyers that are trying to work with the slop that the government has legislated in the judicial area. The erosion of civil rights in those areas is a real worry. I really underscore what you're saying, Phoebe, about the ability for the state to actually infiltrate. The weird thing is that if you're being under surveillance at the moment, you probably will never know. And so and maybe many people obviously aren't going to be, but that cloud can creep into a country.
Does it concern you that Close-Up spent more time on the personal well-being of Happy Feet than some of than losing our right to a jury trial? Is that a concern?
This is where our criticisms of the mainstream come in really strongly on a program like this. There is a voice for independent media, and this is why, because the gloss and the glitz and the mirror glass kind of corporate fascinations of some of the mainstream's current affairs programs, it just turns people off. And I think
that's the next question then. Will the media honeymoon end with John Key? It has to, doesn't it?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that there is a strong Labour lineup that has been put in. I think that we are, particularly over the Teapot Gate scandal, I think that honeymoon may have ended with that second term. Although, as Selwyn says, I just don't think that there is enough time spent on mainstream news on politics or on our 7 o'clock programs
And I
either.
don't know why.
Close
I mean,
Up or
obviously,
Campbell Live.
John Key is a real showman. You know, he's not going to turn ratings off, is he? So why don't they actually cover it in a sense?
It was interesting that it was John Key who broke the honeymoon off, wasn't it? It wasn't the mainstream media going, hey, we're going to start asking you some critical questions now. It was him heavying them with the police, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a bit. I mean, but it started, I reckon, with the independents.
Yeah.
Criticising, Burton Hickey criticising the government's economic plan and its borrowing and its deep ditch on that. Independents like us at Scoop, like yourselves in the blogosphere, actually critiquing what was going on. People then in the mainstream like Duncan Garner, Patrick Gower.
Good guys,
starting
they're
to think,
like dogs.
we're sick of this.
Lock onto it.
This following the National Party line, started to challenge. And once that lid was lifted off, I think then John Key felt bruised. How dare they? That's when he thought spitefully, I'll sick the cops onto these dogs. And that's what he did.
Next question was the story of 2011 child poverty and how effectively was it ignored?
Oh, I don't know. It was one of the stories of 2011. I don't think that it got as much coverage as it should have. I think that there were strong attempts to cover it, but I think one of the problems is that people have a kind of mental barrier with thinking about poverty in New Zealand.
Right. It's first world poverty,
it's
isn't it?
first world poverty,
Right.
not third world poverty.
And that justifies it somehow, doesn't it?
You know, that a lot of the people that make the legislation as well, you know, come from those upper classes or middle to upper classes. They
do not have any empathy.
It's what
Yeah,
Pierre
no
Bourdieu
empathy,
would call
yeah.
cultural capital that excludes, you know, people at the bottom from being able to get in and make those decisions. I think it's an urgent issue that we need to address. We've got the United Nations warning our government on it, and we have got, you know, at the moment legislation going through that's going to make it worse.
I'd like to applaud the work of the Child Poverty Action Group.
Great people.
Its mix of dedicated people to the rights of children and academics actually putting out research for media to actually use that is sound and solid. Even the Prime Minister, in his attempts to actually slag it off, was not successful in that when it was tested.
That's right.
Really good work. What worries me in the child poverty areas is that this country, it should not have poverty to this degree. Yes, we define it differently than what you would in some of the third world countries, but it's still an abomination on us and our choices at governance level on where we apply our money that this country generates. And it's a shocker. The other thing is a major concern, still connected to children, is the abuse of children at the moment, and also the number of violent crimes against children, including murder and manslaughter, seem to me to be on the rise in 2011. Now that I guess sociologists would look at why that's the case, and it's not for me to say. But I think that it's almost getting to a point where we're not even hardly noticing. And I know in Māori circles, Māoridom, they're really looking at that. But this country's got a lot of Pākehā and other ethnicities too, and we need to all inclusively and share this burden and look at every one of our children and the situation that they're in and try to do something.
Do you think it's because they're beneficiary children that we just shrug
it's not
and so
always
it's not our...
beneficiary
Well,
children.
you're right, it's not, but the perception certainly is.
The stigma is.
And in this country, we just don't give a damn about beneficiaries.
I hope that that's not the case.
Okay, but do you think that's got something
I
to
would
do with
hope
it?
that that's not the case, but I do think that it's clear that the beneficiary bashing does win votes.
Doesn't
I mean, we saw this in this election, that you had tiny numbers of beneficiaries that were making kind of mainstream news. The example, of course, would be Paula Bennett talking about, a woman that had a child of 14 already and were about to have another child, not being eligible for the benefit, and it came out that that was actually only 70 women last year.
That's right.
So I think it is something that wins votes, and there is this real sort of problem.
I think it comes down to all of us sharing a responsibility. If we live in Central Auckland, West Auckland, North Shore, South Auckland, we know our neighbours. Let's engage with our neighbours, and be a part of a community instead of our independent, isolationist kind of mentalities that the politicians obviously would often want us to.
We are becoming an gated community,
and maybe there's a key to us all solving problems instead of waiting for the government to do it.
And looking at the stresses on families too. I mean, you only have to look at the way that the calls to the helpline after the Christchurch earthquake went up significantly with those stresses on families. So we really do need to pay close attention to that
Next question. How would you rate the Occupy movement domestically and internationally? You've had quite a bit to do with them.
Yeah, I have been writing on the Occupy movement.
Yep.
Internationally, I think that it is one of the most significant movements of our time. One thing that I have been watching is basically this kind of, Bill Gates talked about this at Davos in 2005, that, you know, where do you see the internet going? And this was the same year that YouTube was born. And he said, well, we will see this growth of transnational human rights images. And that is one thing that the people involved in the Arab uprising did very, very well. They would take these images of violence and then they would circulate around the world. I think in the United States, regardless of what people say, it has been an effective political movement. You have had much more attention placed on the financial transactions tax. If you look at New York itself, you have Bloomberg has arrested half of the Democrat candidates for the 2013 mayoralty.
Yeah.
So this will be an issue that bites back. It also gives Obama a bit more kind of breathing room, and it has also, you know, drawn a large amount of attention to this notion of civil rights in public spaces. In New Zealand, I think that it has been successful in some ways, and that it provided a democratic space for people to be able to go into and actually discuss issues of the economy. And I think that we've got this huge kind of voter disjoint that is occurring at the moment, and a lot of young people are also sort of seeing Occupy as an alternative to participating in that system. But I think that that has to do with not enough education or news media on these kind of issues, and that perhaps it offered them that.
Thoughts on the Occupy movement?
Yeah, I think it's visionary, and I see it more cultural at this stage. And I kind of, it'd be interesting to see how those definitions kind of shift in 2012. I think too that in Auckland, there was a awful situation where some of those from other decades were getting in front of the occupied movement people. The younger generation who deserve to have a say. These older ones were getting in there and taking television time. And in many cases, I know from a media perspective, I just thought, oh no, what's going on here? Is Television New Zealand trying to skew a bias against this group, or were the journalists naive? I think they'd know who I was talking about. But I think in general, the cultural movement that we're seeing from this is an exciting thing. It's coming up with new ideas and new visions, a new way of embracing a participation with the progress of each of our countries. And it's early days, and I don't think we can define it as won or lost its objectives yet. Time will tell.
I think what Occupy Auckland needs to do is move out of that shitty little area in Aotea Square.
Well, they've been evicted, haven't they? They've got 48 hours or less than that now.
And they need to move to Albert Park. That's where because you think about it, Albert Park in summer, who doesn't want to live in Albert Park? You can expand the numbers dramatically because you can get much more people than on the bloody concrete there.
And it's up on a hill.
It's up on a hill, and you've got people constantly, university students moving in and out of there. Great places to recruit. Run it past them. I want 10% on that. Moving on. How would you rate Len Brown on the Super City 2011? How was it?
I think he's done quite a good job, actually. I would have to say. I think he had a very difficult position in uniting factions, and especially with the Super City that was always going to have a lot of political interference. And we've seen that on things like the council-controlled organisations where the government largely appoints a board. I think he had a very rough time
over the trains, didn't they?
Yeah, over the Rugby World Cup with Murray McCully coming in. And I think that has really completely sort of slanted his perception with Aucklanders, and I think that has been something that may affect his re-election. But I think in terms of his job, he did keep rates down fairly low. You know, he has done some great initiatives for Auckland, and I think that, you know, that was always going to be a very difficult job.
How would you rate it?
Yeah, no, it's been impressive. One of the things I've noticed in the centre of Auckland is a rejuvenated culture starting to develop. If you go down on weekends, you go down, you know, any evening, and you can actually see activity going on. You can feel it and breathe it. Most of it is positive and should be embraced. And I think that's down to Len and his team.
Yes.
The challenge is out in the outskirts of this super city now. Out in South Auckland, Franklin, up in the north in Rodney. We've got to remember that Auckland is no longer defined by our inner city and Queen Street. It is defined by the whole of this isthmus. And that's the challenge that Len and his team are still trying to actually address.
Rapid fire round. Out of 10, how would you rate National 2011 out of 10?
About 4. Yeah.
4 out of national out of 10.
How do you define it?
Yeah.
On a populous basis?
Your views.
4.7 to 4.8 on the actual, you know, the public's liking for him. But from the point of view of what they're contributing to where New Zealand is going, I would say 3 at the most.
Labour, out of 10?
Labour, probably about a 5. I don't think,
That's very generous. What would you give Labour out
Well,
of 10?
I'd draw a line in the sand to a week ago. and from a hope point of view, I would say a 7.
Right, from a hope point. The Greens, what have they done?
I think they've done the home installation program, the cycleway. I think
we've
you'd
all
have to,
heard that. Yeah.
But
That doesn't do anything.
Getting that
Nothing.
many
Keeps
new
you warm and
MPs
winter.
in, I think that you'd have to give them about sort of a 7 or 8
Oh,
for
what?
actually rejuvenating their party so much.
Sakes,
But not in terms of
outrageously
politically,
high.
but getting
Well,
so many people in.
I think that their campaign kind of elevated, the position. I'd say a 6, but remember, if you ask that question in 6 months' time, I
Yeah.
think the Greens are going to go through a period where they're really trying to get their team organised, the
Yeah.
logistics of all these new MPs,
I am
really
being too
challenging.
generous.
Yeah,
aren't I?
I give them a 2. ACT, what would you give ACT?
I would give ACT
You can
a
go
2.
negative here.
Yeah, ACT a 2. I mean, ACT has been, one of those funny stories of the year, hasn't it? We had Don Brash coming in saying 15% and then just the party crumbling. So
I'd give ACT a 0
Yeah.
from the point of view as ACT no longer exists.
Yeah.
We've got it as a satellite of the National
Yeah.
Party. We've got this clown actually in
Yeah.
Parliament.
Yeah.
How can you vote?
I give them negative 5. Māori Party, how have they done this year?
I think about a 4. I think they're in a really difficult
Just
position.
handing these points out, aren't you?
No, I think when you look at Māori, it's initiatives like Kura Kaupapa, Wānanga and so on actually go through under national governments. Under Labour, their unemployment subsides. So Māori Party are in a very difficult position. They don't necessarily fit the kind of Pākehā-dominated paradigm. And I think
How many points?
Māori Party 4.5. The reasons being, I think it has aligned itself to corporate iwi very well.
Yep.
But it has forgotten urban Māori.
That's right.
And so
Mana
scale
Party?
down for that.
Mana Party, probably about a 2.
Yeah.
I think that their vote collapsed, which was a big problem, and that by-election was far too late.
Yep.
I think that it's going to be really interesting to see how they survive as a party. Yeah.
Mana?
I would say a 3 to a 4. The reason being, I think Hone Harawira really showed the country that he is a leader and he can contribute to the progress of this country. It was interesting. And policy, I think Mana's policy in the campaign helped to actually get some attention on some core values and ways, alternative ways like the FT.
I would agree.
United
with you,
Future, out of 10.
Probably about a 1.
Oh,
I
yeah,
think
but
they're
damn it,
dying,
he's
aren't
back,
they?
isn't
Come on,
he?
you were
He's
nice to
back.
him on iPrediction.
Yeah,
Incredibly
nice.
to a 9. For
United Future, what are you going to give him?
a 2.
Okay.
Only because he's got stickability.
I feel like I'm giving
How can
arbitrary
he
numbers.
How can he turn up to work and pass some of those policies along with his national mates and go home and sleep easier?
Finish the sentence. New Zealand stands on the brink of...
Disengagement, I think, in terms of the number of people that are voting and so on. I think this is a huge issue that we need to absolutely address in terms of our politicians. I mean, maybe this is the way that people argue so partisan that it makes issues harder for voters to follow. But I think that we really, when we get that low level of voter participation, we need to re-engage people.
Finish the sentence. New Zealand stands on the brink of...
Of redefining what it really is to be a New Zealander. I think that we'll see that starting to shape from the opposition parties and not from the government.
Thank you, Phoebe. Thank you, Selwyn. Ladies and gentlemen, to my 2011 final word. Possums, I'm an old-fashioned New Zealander. I like to think our egalitarian culture and history of leading social justice issues makes us a unique and special place to live. Sadly, 3 years of a money trader peddling vacant aspiration while implementing trickle-up economic policy where we, the majority, subsidise tax cuts for the rich, has seen that egalitarian vision of New Zealand urinated and shat upon. Under John Key, our inequality has soared and 150 of the richest New Zealand families gained $7 billion in 1 year while 200,000 New Zealand children lived in poverty. These are truths we should be terribly ashamed of. I find it an abomination that solo mums, the mentally unwell and the ill, of being forced to do with less for a global economic recession, none of them had any hand in making. How many beneficiaries were on the phone to the Wall Street stockbrokers in 2008, buying light crude in euros while speculating on the Goldman Sachs derivatives market? To punish the weak while enriching the already wealthy is not a New Zealand I have any pride in. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded new citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Next week, we have the Citizen A 2012 prediction show with TVNZ7's Wallace Chapman and Labour's David Cunliffe to make predictions of 2012's political and economic future. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.